And I can prove to you that Aisha radiallahu anha was 18 years old and not 6 or 9 when she married the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. I say this because the age of Aisha radiallahu anha at the time of her marriage is one of the most misunderstood and misused aspects of Islamic history, especially by Islamophobes and Christian apologists. They quote the only widely cited narration or hadith, which states that Aisha radiallahu anha was engaged to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam at the age of 6. And the marriage was consummated when she was 9. However, a deeper examination of Islamic sources reveals that this number is far from conclusive. And there is strong historical evidence that Aisha radiallahu anha was 18 or older at the time of marriage consummation, and not what is circulated as child marriage. Keep in mind, we're trying to understand the cultural norms of 2000 years ago and beyond from a 21st century lenses. And for people who are not inclined in comparative religion, theology, history, textual criticism, hadith, fiqh, and even other languages, this report might seem very barbaric without understanding the historical context. And in the minds of the West, there have been conditioned into certain numbers. If you ask anyone today what age marriage should take place, they would respond without hesitation 18 years old. But can you prove that? Can you prove that it must be the number 18, either objectively or scientifically? See, this is why we have such a disparity in the world when it comes to the age of marriage. And we start seeing this person, that person is considered a child predator if it's not done according to our laws. And so we fall into issues when comparing the social norms of this land versus that land. And what basis the age must be the number 18? Does that mean if someone is 18 and the girl is 16 or 17, is he considered an abuser? Because most school kids today are sexually active at a very shocking young age. I have delivered a baby from a 13 years old whose boyfriend was 17, and this was done with the consent of their parents. I have delivered babies from 14, 15, and 16 years olds. But 13 was the youngest I've seen in my career. Now, the 13 years old looked like she was 20 because, again, remember, age is just a number. Age has nothing to do with maturity or development. And there are many factors that contribute to the age. If you compare kids who grew up in the mountains, the country, and rough areas with the kids who grew up in the city with lavish life, you'll realize the social differences that affect the age, let alone the age dynamics 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. This is why this topic is so difficult to deal with, because people are conditioned to think of the number 18. Another reason why I critically analyzed all the available data from prominent Muslim and non Muslim scholars, historians, and theologians, and concluded that Aisha radiallahu anha indeed was older at the time of consummation. So let's break this down using solid, scholarly, respected sources, not apologetics, but history. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Greetings and good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tawheed Podcast. We're going to be looking at the age of Aisha radiallahu anha when she married the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. The conclusion is drawn from various historical evidences, including A. Calculated timelines of early Islamic events, B. Age gaps between her and her sister Asma radiallahu anha, and C, her participation in early Islam, and D, verifiable hadith and scholarly works. A, B, C, and D all indicate that Aisha radiallahu anha was 18 years older or so when she married the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Therefore, rather than relying on a single hadith with debated context, we must uphold academic integrity by reviewing multiple corroborating sources. But unfortunately, people, as I said, take this one narration, this one hadith, supposedly coming from Aisha radiallahu anha, against all this sahih, authentic narrations and historical evidence. You can see how this is such an important topic. And one of the key points Christian apologists and Islamophobes use against Islam and against the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Some of them say horrendous things about the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam because of what they believe concerning the age of Aisha radiallahu anha during her marriage. And so it's really important that we address this topic to correct the misconceptions because I do think that it creates question marks, not only for non Muslims, but also for some Muslims as well. So this is not just aimed at Islamophobes and Christian apologists, but it's really aimed at Muslims and people in general in hope to better understand this intimidating topic. And honestly, sometimes I wonder if it's appropriate to speak about this topic because for those who studied history, you know the age at which people typically got married has varied significantly throughout history and across different cultures. In the early Middle Ages, for example, women often married in their teens, with some marrying even younger or soon after puberty. Over time, the average age of marriage generally increased, particularly in the Western world, where it rose to the late teens by the late 20th century. But marriage ages in general were often dictated by practical considerations and social norms, with women marrying very young. So, what are your thoughts on this topic? What's the moral age for marriage? Let me know in the comment section if you have any questions, because honestly, this is a very disturbing topic, but I think it's necessary since the majority of people speak about this topic without knowledge. So let's get to it and start with the historical evidence, with the sources and all the authentic narrations available to us. Because evidence is really important for this topic, as the report or the hadith says that Aisha radiallahu anha was 9 when she married the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. This is commonly used because it's the only report which says that she was 9 and everything else is based around or on this report. However, people who base things on this report, they don't look at the historical evidence and other reports as well, such as Sahih Ahadith, which appear in Bukhari and Muslim. People just ignore them for some reason. And it's interesting. There is this Christian apologist. You might know, I don't need to mention names. His YouTube live shows start by asking Muslims the famous question: is child marriage legal? The Muslim response is always no, of course. The Christian apologist again sarcastically asks, then why did Muhammad marry Aisha at 9 years old? You see, the dilemma is that in this Christian apologist's mind, the age standard of a 9 years old in 2025 must be applied to a 9 years old 1500 years ago, 2000 years ago, or 5000 years ago. This is the jahiliyyah, the ignorance we have to always respectfully but firmly respond to. That's why we need to educate people and present solid historical evidence. We don't marry children. That's satanic. Child marriage is not only morally illegal, but also a crime that constitutes severe punishment in this life and the hereafter. This is a nice way of saying this person practicing child marriage or underage trafficking should be publicly executed, if you want my honest, brutal opinion. That's exactly where all Muslims stand on this issue. But what about the report that says Aisha radiallahu anha was married to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam at 9? Well, this report is called Mawquf Hadith, which means stopped or suspended in the Arabic language, indicating that the chain of narration is terminated at the level of the Prophet's companions. The narrator, the sanad, because the chain of narrators does not go all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. It goes back to a sahabi, a companion. You follow me? Mawquf refers to a narration in which the statements or actions are attributed to a sahabi and not to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam himself. And in this case, it seems like Aisha radiallahu anha herself, because she was a sahabiya, a companion as well. So in this hadith, in this report, it seems, and we should also take this into consideration, that it was narrated through a chain of narrators. It was reported that Aisha radiallahu anha said, the marriage contract was made at the age of 6, and the marriage consummation at the age of 9 or 10, according to some other reports as well. Now, I can hear the Christian apologists in the background saying, exactly, Aisha testified that her marriage took place at the age of 9. Well, there are a number of issues with this chain of narration, if it was taken literally, especially from a historical perspective. Because when we look at the history, there is actually serious contradictions there. And it just does not add up with certain events. We know that the noble Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam was the most decent, humble, honest man in history. Alayhi salatu wasalam. Historians have testified to this, and there is no doubt about that. And what's interesting, pay attention to this. This report of Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam marrying Aisha radiallahu anha at the age of 6 or 9 was never an issue to the Christian and the Jewish communities living at the time of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Why? Because they understood the customs of that time. And some might ask, but what customs are you talking about? The customs of child marriage? No, 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 no. It's actually not child marriage customs. Arabia had customs that were known to the world at that time and for centuries afterwards. And the West did not think that's a good argument to be had until the 21st century, or rather the 20th century, where the Western secularist polemics, being dressed up as Christians, thought, you know what? Let's start a trend. Let's start a viral. If the Prophet had a 6 years old girl as a wife, is that somebody you think you should follow? And this is the cultural norms in today's West, using them unfairly to produce a polemic. This is sadly something that Christian missionaries and apologists pass on to their co-religionists and critically, and it just spreads like wildfire. The reality is, the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, marriage to Aisha radiallahu anha is not unbiblical. And that practice in marriage would have been considered the norm in Jewish cultures at the time of Jesus alayhi salam. And even earlier, for example, the time of Moses alayhi salam. So why do the Christian apologists predominantly using this flawed and offensive arguments against Muslims? There has to be a reason, right? Why aren't they telling the Sikhs their religion is false because Guru Singh married a 12 years old? Why aren't they telling the Jews their religion is false? Because the rabbis allow sex with 10 years old girls. Why aren't they telling Jews about what Moses did in the Old Testament and asking them to reject him as a prophet? And closer to their home, why aren't they knocking on their co religionists' doors and yelling at them to stop following the Trinitarian views of Jesus, as that teaches that Jesus allowed the beating of females and even the killing of children and women? On and on and on. See, that's why we need to analyze this topic with historical, factual evidence and leave the emotions to the side. And so, when looking at this report of Aisha radiallahu anha being engaged to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam at the age of 6, and the marriage was consummated when she was 9, the first evidence that comes in the example of a historian called Jarullah Bigiev. Musa Jarullah Bigiev. Musa is not only a historian, but also a theologian and a philosopher. He has a book titled Hatun. And in page 81 of this book, he says, and I quote, in the meaning, and this is also where I want you to pay attention, very close attention. He says, according to Arab customs, when girls reach the age of puberty, when girls start their menstrual cycle, they would have this ceremony in Mecca. It was called Muhayyiz or Mu'ay ceremony. It means that they have entered into adolescence and they used to be considered as a woman after that. End of quote. Interestingly enough, Jewish traditions up to today have similar puberty celebration or ceremony called bar or bat mitzvah. When Jewish boys or girls reach the age of puberty, this ceremony marks the time when a boy or girl becomes a Jewish adult. They call them adults the moment they reach puberty. They are not kids anymore. This means that they are now responsible for their own actions and can decide for themselves how they would like to practice Judaism. Similarly, the Arabs also had a puberty ceremony, and many of the Arab women, especially the noble ones amongst the nobility, they used to start counting their age after that time. You follow me? So Musa Jarullah is saying that according to the Arab customs, just like their cousins, the Jewish, they used to start counting their age after the ceremony, puberty. Arabs start counting the age not at birth. They would start counting the age after puberty. And basically, they considered puberty to be the actual birth. Puberty marked the start of the age. If you read the Bible or indeed any historical source about marriage, you would become quickly aware that child marriages, or what we call today as child marriages, were an extremely widespread phenomenon and continue to be a widespread phenomenon. But the very idea of childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, when most women did not reach the age of 40 or died at birth, childbirth, is historically contingent construct, hardly some type of objective empirical fact. And so when Abi Khaliqan ibn Sa'd ibn Hisham or Ibn Ishaq or Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi would, for example, transmit reports about Aisha radiallahu anha, what they were transmitting was not a specific age as a numerical number of years that a human being has been alive, but an age topos. And until modern times, and in fact, some people rarely knew their age. And before passports, ID cards, and documents, people would hear contested stories about when they were born. My own grandmother, for example, who we believe was over 100 years old when she passed away, was not sure when she was born, and her age was always contested by family members. And so, with rudimentary historical sensibility, we would understand that the historical topos is simply an allegation or claim that Aisha radiallahu anha was a young person, younger than the regular age that most girls married. What specific age, year this was, we don't know and we'll never know. Now, to say something such as this would make Aisha radiallahu anha a liar makes absolutely no historical sense because it claimed that Aisha was truthful or not assumes that Aisha indeed uttered any of the reports attributed to her, which is an unsupported presumption. And keep in mind that Aisha radiallahu anha also became the subject of numerous historical inventions and counter inventions. And so, having said that, if we look at this narration where Aisha radiallahu anha says, I was 9 when I was married to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, we need to add the time before she began her menstrual cycle, which is the age of puberty, and that makes her roughly about 18 years old. This custom means when Aisha radiallahu anha said when she was 9, it referred to the years after reaching the puberty, not her biological age from birth. I get it. Some people might say this is very speculative, but that's why I want to use very powerful evidence to support this that she would have been 18 years old or older. And this suggests that she reached puberty around 9, which is reasonable for a female, and then plus 9 is 18. So she was 18 years old plus. And the fact that she was 9 years old of age when she reached puberty should not be surprising, especially given recent studies that have found that the onset of puberty has fluctuated dramatically throughout history. However, one may rightfully retort that just because a young girl has begun the process of physically maturing, this does not necessitate that she therefore possesses an adult mentality. To suggest otherwise would be considered absurd by contemporary standards. And that's a very appropriate conclusion to come to considering that even by today's standards, we don't necessarily regard legally acknowledged adults as independent and functioning members of society. They still need time to learn and experience the world before being considered cognitive and emotionally mature. There is a reason that 18 years olds today still largely rely on their parents for the economic support, despite the law defining them as mature. That said, our ancestors faced very difficult circumstances to which they had to adapt, circumstances that determined their physical and psychological fitness. In this regard, indoctrinologists such as Peter Gluckman and Mark Hansen have emphatically stated, and I find this very interesting. They stated that the mismatch between biological and psychological maturation is a relatively recent phenomenon, which is so true. This is why presentism is such a pervasive fallacy. Even scientists themselves have been prone to the error, often mistaking biological age with psychological fitness. But perhaps the most relevant example of how presentism negatively affects our understanding of the past can be seen in the contemporary moral judgments regarding the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam's marriage to Aisha radiallahu anha. Aisha radiallahu anha herself stated that she had reached maturity prior to her marriage. In the hadith that was narrated by Aisha herself, and she says, I had seen my parents following Islam since I attained the age of reason, which is puberty. Not a day passed, but the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam visited us both in the mornings and evenings. Now, what this hadith states is clear if one is aware of the context surrounding it. In 622, after suffering years of religious persecution at the hands of the pagan in Mecca, she and her family decided to migrate to safe haven in the neighboring city of Medina. Upon their arrival, Aisha radiallahu anha's parents set up a temporary residence where she eventually came down with a fever, maybe possibly due to being weakened by the long and arduous journey prior. It was around this time that the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, was visiting them both in the mornings and in the evenings. And when she began to notice her parents' outward expression of faith, shortly after that, Aisha radiallahu anha would consummate her marriage with the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, and move into his household, completing the marriage contract as a full fledged woman. So while it is certainly true that the onset of puberty does not make someone an adult today, again, this same judgment does not apply to people of the past. And by indulging in presentism, we disregard the facts of how our ancestors were forced to live just to survive. Furthermore, we open ourselves to intellectual embarrassment by misrepresenting history. And I can say that this is not an apologetic argument, it is actually based on historical facts. Now, another interesting fact and evidence is from a book by Maulana Shibli, who he lived in the 1800s. He was a famous historian and theologian. The book is called Asr al-Sadat, Volume 2, page 9. Asr al-Sadat, Volume 2, page 9. In his book, he clearly says that when Aisha radiallahu anha married the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, she was 18. Very clear and cut. And you can refer to this book. It's in volume 2, page 9. This is a very important book by a very famous and important historian. We also find another evidence that supports this in a book called Khatamul Anbiya, page 21, from Hayatul Sahaba. And this is by Hikmat Burki. And he states that historical records show that Asma radiallahu anha, who is the older sister of Aisha radiallahu anha, died at the age 73rd year of the Hijrah at the age of 100. Meaning, after the Hijrah, after the migration, Asma radiallahu anha died at the age of 100. That was the 73rd year of Hijrah in Medina. He goes on to explain that Asma radiallahu anha migrated to Medina when she was 27. And she lived 73 years in Medina after the Hijrah. So 73 years in Medina plus 27 years in Mecca is 100 years. And many other historical records also show that Asma radiallahu anha was 27 when she migrated to Medina. Now, we know by historical facts that Asma radiallahu anha was 10 years older than Aisha radiallahu anha. And we have many sources for this 10 years gap between them. This means that when Aisha radiallahu anha migrated to Medina, she was roughly 18 years old. And we know by fact that she married the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam after they migrated. Some say 6 months to a year after she migrated. The stronger view is that she was 18 when she married the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Another historical evidence is in the initial years of prophethood. So when the Quran began to be revealed at the beginning, there were people who embraced Islam first. So those first people who embraced Islam earned a specific title السابقون الأولون translates to the foremost pioneers. In Islamic context, it refers to the earliest Muslims who embraced Islam and made great sacrifices in its early stages. They are often associated with the Muhajirun, the immigrants, and Al Ansar, the helpers of Medina. Such blessed souls whom Allah Azza wa Jal honored with a timeless ode in the Quran saying, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم والسابقون الأولون من المهاجرين والأنصار والذين اتبعوهم بإحسان رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه وأعد لهم جنات تجري تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها ذلك الفوز العظيم صدق الله العظيم. The translation of the meaning is as for the foremost immigrants and the helpers and those who follow them in goodness, Allah Azza wa Jal is pleased with them and they are pleased with Him, and He has prepared for them gardens under which rivers flow, residing in there forever. That is the great success. This is in Surah At-Tawbah, page verse 100. Now, interestingly enough, the name of Aisha radiallahu anha is mentioned among the names of As-Sabiqun al-Awwalun. You follow me? The Quran began to be revealed in 610. And this is very interesting. If we take Aisha radiallahu anha's narration only, if we take that one report as a benchmark, she would not have been born at that year in 610. It was impossible. So if we say she consummated the marriage at 9, then she should not have been born then, because Islam was 12 years old then. And afterwards, they migrated. The migration to Habasha, Abyssinia, happened in 622. So that would not suggest that she was born 4 years after the first revelation. If you calculate it, it's 614. It turns out that she was born in 614, which is not possible because she is considered from As-Sabiqun al-Awwalun, amongst the people who embraced Islam in the initial years. So mathematically, that does not compute. So she had to be old enough to even accept Islam. And if we look at the historical facts, it seems like she was born in 605, most likely, making her at least 5 or 6 at the beginning of Revelation, and 17, 18 during the migration. Again, if you look at all these different historical facts, it always turns out to be 18 when she migrated to Medina. This means she married the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, at the age of 18. And we have no doubts about that from a historical perspective. These are all academic references and historical evidence you can have as a reference. And I am not just making speculations here. Another powerful source that Muslim viewers will agree, since they consider this person to be a very powerful hadith imam, who is Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah, in his book تهذيب الأسماء واللغات تهذيب الأسماء واللغات, volume 2, page 597. He states, and there is another hadith, by the way, in which supports this as well. It is in Al-Mustadrak ala Sahihain, volume 3, page 635, by Al-Hakim al-Nishapuri. So again, Imam al-Nawawi states that Asma radiallahu anha, the older sister of Aisha radiallahu anha, was born in the year 595. Now, Asma is older than Aisha, and there is 10 years gap. Asma embraced Islam at the age of 15. But since Aisha is 10 years younger, that puts Aisha being born in 605. Again, 595 plus 10 is 605. And this makes her roughly 18 years old during Hijrah, during the migration. So both of these books suggest that she was born around 605, based on these calculations. And these are reported by Imam al-Nawawi and Al-Hakim as well. So these are historical facts, and we have many factual evidence, historical evidence against that one report, that one narration. But for some reason, people hold on to that narration because of Islamophobia that is behind it. And they try to attack Islam from through this window. That's why we have all these historical facts that any sound, sane person would be convinced that Aisha radiallahu anha was 18 years old when she married the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Another significant evidence comes from a hadith in Bukhari, Sahih al-Bukhari, hadith 4993. It is in Fada'il al-Quran, page 6. Now, where Aisha herself, again, says, I was a young girl playing with toys when the verse from Surah Al-Qamar was revealed. The verse from Surah Al-Qamar that says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بل الساعة موعدهم والساعة أدهى وأمر صدق الله العظيم. In the meaning of the translation, but nay, the hour or the last hour is the time when they call truly meet their fate, and that last hour will be most catastrophic and most bitter. This is in Surah Al-Qamar, verse 46. Now, Aisha says, I was playing with toys when the verse was revealed. This verse was revealed 9 years before the Hijrah. 9 years before the Hijrah, between 613 or 614. If Aisha was already a young girl playing with toys at that time, she must have been at least 5 or 6 years old, meaning she was born around 605 or 608, not 614. Here is the interesting thing. She remembers the day this verse was revealed. But when we look at the historical facts, again, when the verse was revealed, it was actually revealed in the house of Ibn al-Arqam in the year 614. You follow me? Well, if she wasn't even born yet, if we consider the other narrations, because according to the other narrations, she was born in 614. But she remembers when this verse was revealed. And she says, I was playing with toys. Surely and clearly she wasn't newborn for her to remember. It's impossible because she says she remembers it. And just for those who like to make fun of Aisha radiallahu anha being young and playing with dolls, my grandmother was 100 years old and she was still collecting dolls for herself and other kids to play with. We still have toys and dolls that my grandmother collected and passed on to my mother, who in turn passed them to my sisters. Playing with dolls does not indicate young age. Playtime is not only confined to young age. I know grown men today in their 50s and 60s who collect and play with Spider Man and Batman. Just saying. Because the most obvious manifestation of this fallacy is demonstrated by Christian apologists who love to quote the following narration when arguing that Aisha radiallahu anha was not mature enough to be married. Where Aisha radiallahu anha narrated, I used to play with dolls in the presence of the Prophet, and my girlfriends also used to play with me. And when Allah's apostle used to enter my dwelling place, they used to hide themselves, but the Prophet ﷺ would call them to join and play with me. Now, many people assume that since Aisha radiallahu anha was playing with dolls, she must have still been a child at the time of this narration. Prior to addressing the implication that playing with dolls equates to lacking maturity, what is immediately noticeable about this hadith is the statement in brackets, which says, a little girl not yet reached the age of puberty. This is in brackets if you look at the hadith. However, there is a glaring problem with the way this hadith is presented. For those thinking this is a clear affirmation that she was a child, the fact of the matter is that the last statement is nowhere to be found in the hadith itself. Rather, it is an addition from a hadith commentary called فتح الباري في شرح صحيح البخاري. فتح الباري في شرح صحيح البخاري, authored by the famous hadith scholar رضي الله عنه Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani in 1449. This is important to note because it's not made apparent in the hadith itself. The fact that some translators of the hadith have decided to include this is also telling. For what reason did they put this commentary in the hadith? And why would Ibn al-Hajar claim that Aisha radiallahu anha had not reached puberty? Now, in order to answer these questions, we need only to refer to Al-Asqalani himself, which says, and I quote, I, meaning Ibn Hajar, he's speaking here and he's saying, I, to say with certainty that she was not yet at the age of puberty is questionable, though it might be a possibility to be so. This because Aisha radiallahu anha was 14 years old at the time of the Battle of Khaybar, either exactly 14 years old or having passed her 14th year or approaching it. As far as her age, at the time of the Battle of Tabuk, she had by then definitely reached the age of puberty. Therefore, the strongest view is that of those who said it was in Khaybar when she was not yet at the age of puberty and made reconciliation between the apparent contradictory rulings of the permissibility of dolls in particular and the prohibition of images in general. So what this explanation mean is that Ibn al-Hajar reveals a number of important points which run contrary to the initial impressions of the hadith. The first and foremost obvious issue with Ibn Hajar's commentary is that he admits that Aisha radiallahu anha was 14 years old at the time of this narration takes place, putting her well above the average age of the onset of puberty in the Near East during late antiquity and even by today's standards. This is most likely why Ibn Hajar felt his own conclusion was questionable. Despite his own doubts, however, he suggests she must have not reached puberty due to reasons completely unrelated to her actual biological or psychological maturity. It helped him to reconcile an apparent contradiction in her behavior with the legal prohibition of adults playing with dolls. However, what makes Ibn Hajar's opinion even more tenuous is that his view was countered by other master scholars of hadith and Islamic jurisprudence, such as Imam al-Bayhaqi in 1066, who claimed that the prohibition was only declared after the events narrated in the hadith in question. That aside, it was not uncommon for young women in the past to own and even play with dolls, as these objects would be among the very few possessions, if you think about it, they had prior to marriage. Commenting on the interpretation of toys and similar objects from past societies and cultures, however, many of these realities escape the mindset affected by presentism, placing one in the position of making inappropriate moral judgments about our ancestors and their lived experience. The fact that just a cursory analysis of the aforementioned narration so easily exposes the erroneous assumptions about Aisha radiallahu anha's lack of maturity should be evidence enough to the fallaciousness of this form of reasoning. That said, even if one were to admit to the complexities of childhood and development over time, these realities appear to allude to moral relativism, the idea that moral principles are only valid given their specific time, place, or culture. However, this could not be further from the truth. To see how this is possible, we only need to examine how Muslim jurists derived rulings pertaining to marriage from the Quran and the Sunnah, particularly the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam's relationship with Aisha radiyallahu anha. Bismillah. Now, starting with the primary source of Islamic jurisprudence, the Quran clearly sets a standard age for marriage, which excludes anyone outside of those parameters. The Quran says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وابتلوا اليتامى حتى إذا بلغوا النكاح فإن آنستم منهم رشدا فإن آنستم منهم رشدا فادفعوا إليهم أموالهم ولا تأكلوها إسرافا وبدارا أن يكبروا ومن كان غنيا فليستعفف ومن كان فقيرا فليأكل بالمعروف فإذا دفعتم إليهم أموالهم فأشهدوا وكفى بالله حسيبا. صدق الله العظيم وصدق رسوله الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. It says in the translation, test the orphans until they reach marriageable age. Then, if you find they have sound judgment, hand over their property to them. Do not consume it hastily before they come of age. If the guardian is well off, he should abstain from the orphan's property. And if he is poor, he should use only what is fair. When you give them their property, call witnesses in, but God takes full account of everything you do. This is in chapter 4, verse 6. In other words, the Quran here sets an age limit for marriage. But what exactly is that limit? The text remains ambiguous with regard to a specific number, but Muslim scholars, particularly in the field of Quranic exegesis, tafsir, already understood what was implied. For example, when we examine the commentary of the 14th century Syrian exegete and jurist Ibn Kathir in 1373, we find he elaborated on the consensus surrounding the marriageable age as not referring to specific number, but a physical development, the age of puberty. And that said, there are still more nuances at play here with regard to marriage and maturity. Firstly, Islamic jurists identified two types of marriage: a contractual marriage and a consummated marriage. The former could be legally entered at any point in a person's life and later be revoked through their own volition, regardless of whether they had obtained legal maturity or not. However, such a marriage prohibited any intimate contact between the betrothed and would be comparable today to an engagement. The latter form of marriage, or full marriage, however, required both parties to be physically capable of sexual relations, given the logical implication that such a union would lead to this outcome, which called al-balagha or al-bulugh. Although these two notions may appear similar and redundant in light of the former being marked by onset of puberty, jurists generally viewed physical signs of adulthood as just that, signs, not the de facto evidence of reproductive functionality. In other words, while legal majority often conceded with the permissibility to engage in sexual relations, it was not always or necessarily the case. And if you look at today, even the feminist critics of Islamic law, such as, for example, Professor Judith Tucker, who have recognized this nuance, saying, and I quote in the meaning, a marriage could be contracted before either party was ready for sexual intercourse. But a marriage could not be consummated until both bride and groom were physically mature. And she goes on to say that such maturity was not equated with puberty, the marker of legal majority, but rather could be reached before its onset. For a girl, readiness for sexual intercourse was signaled in large part by her appearance, by whether or not she had become an object of desire, or what we call fleshy, or buxom, physical attributes that signified that she could now endure intercourse. And this is what uh, Professor Tucker said. Until such time, the marriage, although legally contracted, clearly lacked an essential element when determining the physical maturity of an individual. Jurists often relied on physical features, and this is the most common being if the person in question actually looked like an adult. Many jurists even went so as far to declare an average age by which such a physical maturity should be reached is 15 to 17. In other words, what determined maturity depends entirely on a society's normative judgments of sexual attractiveness and functionality. However, such nuance has been lost on Islamophobes, who, in their utter desperation to impugn Islam and its followers, interpret certain passages of the Quran as condoning pedophilia or child abuse. And for example, many critics often reference the famous, the most misunderstood verse to bolster their accusation, where Allah Azza wa Jal says in the Quran, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم واللائي يئسن من المحيض من نسائكم إن ارتبتم فعدتهن ثلاثة أشهر واللائي لم يحضن وأولات الحمل أولات الأحمال أجلهن أن يضعن حملهن ومن يتق الله يجعل له من أمره يسرا. صدق الله العظيم وصدق رسوله الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Now, the translation of the meaning, it says, if you are in doubt, the period of waiting will be 3 months for those women who have ceased menstruation. And for those who have not yet menstruated, the waiting period of those who are pregnant will be until they deliver their burden. Allah Azza wa Jal makes things easy for those who are mindful of Him. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. Critics in fear from the above verse that there being a waiting period for girls who have not yet menstruated indicates that it is permissible to engage in sexual relations with prepubescent girls. However, this is an invalid conclusion because it neglects the different types of marriage and maturities in Islamic law. A case in point, the fact that a girl had not yet reached puberty was only evidence that she had yet to manifest the usual signs pertaining to legal majority, not um, not that she was physically immature. A girl could technically still be considered mature, based on other physical features, such as her biological age. With regard to this particular possibility, the leading Central Asian 12th century jurist Ali ibn Abu Bakr al Marghinani in 1197 provided his legal context behind the above verse, saying, and I quote, and he says, and similarly, those who have attained puberty, which is al balagha, by age, but have not menstruated, based on the end of the verse, and those who have not menstruated, meaning those who have reached puberty by age, but not by menstruation, those who have attained puberty by reaching the age of 15 years, according to the opinion of both Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, or 17 years according to the opinion of Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, but they have not yet menstruated. When they divorce, they observe a waiting period based on months as well. It should be clear that at this point, that had Islam allowed for the sexual exploitation of children, many of these nuances would not exist. Case in point, the Quran would have never provided clarifications on the types of women who have waiting periods, or even mention a marriageable age to begin with. If it allowed for any woman, regardless of maturity, to engage in sexual relations, and had jurists permitted such acts, the two would never have bothered to distinguish between girls who were physically mature and those who were not. Now, and more importantly, however, had the Prophet himself been perceived as promoting the exploitation of children, then sad scholars would have simply considered the age of 9 to be the only condition necessary for a young girl to be considered mature. However, the age of 9 has never been mentioned as one of the conditions by which to judge maturity in Islamic tradition. Rather, jurists derived a completely different understanding from the relationship between the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, and Aisha radiallahu anha, that he had entered into a contract marriage with her when she was 6 years old of age, and then consummated of marriage after she had reached maturity 3 years later. Simple logical deduction led scholars to conclude that if Islam indeed allowed for the abuse of children, then the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, would not have needed to wait 3 4 years before finalizing his marriage. But he did wait. He waited because he knew that to do otherwise would have caused harm to his wife. And one of the principal objectives, al maqasid, of Islamic law is the prohibition of subjecting oneself to harm, ad darar, or causing harm to others, ad dirar. And I will be explaining or expanding on this topic in details in further podcasts, inshallah, azza wa jal. Moreover, when we look at this narration, it is impossible to accept that she married the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, at a very, very young age, because she was not supposed to have been born yet, as I said, in 614. But for someone to remember such an incident when a verse was revealed, and the verse as well, because she mentions the verse, she had to have been at least 5 or 6 years old, at least, to remember that. So I think this is a very powerful evidence that she definitely was not born in 614. Another important thing here to remember is that according to Aisha radiallahu anha, when she was married, when she was young, and this contradicts all of the historical evidences, because the argument that she would have been born in 614 does not make sense. Because when we look at the historical sources, they indicate, and this is very interesting and very powerful evidence as well, she was engaged to a person called Jubair ibn Mut'im in the year 617. That is before the marriage contract was done with the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, if she was born in 614, then that would make her three when she was engaged to Jubair ibn Mut'im, who is a prominent figure from the Quraysh tribe. This engagement was later provoked or broken off by mutual consent because Aisha radiallahu anha's father Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh embraced Islam, and Jubair ibn Mut'im, who strongly opposed Islam, did not want to be associated with a Muslim family. And so in 622, Jubair was actually one of those involved in an unsuccessful plot to kill the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. And also at the Battle of Uhud, Jubair bribed his slave Wahshi ibn Harb to kill Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib radiallahu anh because Hamza had killed Jubair's uncle at the Badr battle. Jubair, however, radiallahu anh, adopted Islam in the period between the Hudaybiyah Treaty in 628 and the conquest of Mecca in 630, and then settled in Medina, rahimahullah. I was saying, if Aisha radiallahu anha was born in 614, then that would make her three when she was engaged to Jubair ibn Mut'im. That would make it six when she married, when the marriage contract was done. Because initially, she had a marriage contract without the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. And then 3 years later, it was consummated. So going on that understanding, I guess that the numbers 6 and 9, that's where they came from. So she would have been 3 as a baby when she was engaged to Jubair. This is preposterous. This is absurd. No culture would accept that, specifically for a father and a mother. Think about that. It's ridiculous. If there was such a case in the Arabs of that era of ignorance, they would have made this an issue in the first place. Absolutely. They wouldn't have let something like this slip because it was such a communal community that took pride in the family and honor. They would have said, you can't do that. A very powerful argument indeed to attack the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam at that time. But they didn't. They never used it. They never mentioned it because they knew that was a cultural thing at that time. So I think this is a very powerful argument that she could not have been 9 when she married the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. She was at least 18 years old. And in defense of Aisha radiallahu anha, our mother radiallahu anha, which is a discussion, honestly, I've heard many times, and I had no wish to engage in it. Not because the discussion isn't important, it is, but because an introduction to Aisha radiallahu anha's age should not be prioritized. The most important fact of Aisha radiallahu anha's life is not that she married young. Her level of scholarship, her love for the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, and her love for the religion of Islam are the most important aspects of her life. What pains me the most about the conversation around Aisha radiallahu anha's age is not that it exists, but that it is given so much weight, time, and attention. To focus on her age at marriage is to dim the light of her great contributions. Contributions that made the transmission of this beautiful deen so possible. While our mother, Aisha radiallahu anha, may have been younger when she married the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, the controversy surrounding her age is indeed a manufactured one. during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, his enemies would search for any way possible to harm and defame him. They called him crazy, spread false rumors about his wife committing adultery, and even tried to kill him on multiple occasions. They took advantage of any opportunity to physically harm him or expose a potential flaw. So one would have to ask, if the age of Aisha radiallahu anha was truly controversial, why didn't his contemporary enemies used it against him? The controversy over the age of Aisha radiallahu anha is in fact a quite recent phenomenon. It is quite simply an attempt to defame the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, as those of old attempted to do by questioning his judgment and ethics in marrying Aisha radiallahu anha at a younger age. But this attempt at defamation, like all others, falls flat. Now, let's move on to another historical evidence that Aisha radiallahu anha was not a child when she married the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. And the next evidence, this report is in Bukhari, Sahih al-Bukhari. Again, these are all Sahih hadith in Bukhari, where Aisha radiallahu anha explains the days of hardship in Mecca when some of the Sahaba, the companions, Ridwanullahi alayhim, decided to migrate to Abyssinia. As you know, the famous migration to Habasha, Abyssinia, she says, and this is very interesting, she says that her father, Abu Bakr, radiallahu anh, was making plans as well to migrate to Habasha. That's what she says, documented in the hadith of Al Bukhari. But we know from historical records, the migration to Abyssinia took place in 613. So she's saying, my father was making plans to migrate to Abyssinia, and it happened in 613. She was there, she existed. Now, she should not have been born at that time, according to the other reports. 1 year before, she remembers an incident 1 year before her birth. And by the way, I just realized that I'm throwing and mentioning a lot of dates that might confuse the viewers. So, just for clarity sake, the argument is that we know that she was born about 605, but some are alleging that she was born at 614. So you can see the mismatch in time. So if she was born in 605 and the migration happened in 613, then that make her 8. That makes sense. But if she was born in 614, how could she be talking about a migration she was born into? You follow me? You would remember your father is preparing for such a heavy scale of a migration. But how are you going to remember something before you were born? How could she remember and explain events with such details? Because she explains them with precise details as well, which happened a year before she was born, allegedly. So these are very different evidences, historical evidences against just that one narration, and which I think, if you look at the metan, which is the Islamic studies that refers to the text or body of a hadith, that is the actual content or message of the hadith, including the chain of narrators, the isnad, it is considered as the backbone or main text of the report. When you do an analysis on the text, you realize that cannot be correct. We understand that she is counting her age after she had the menstrual cycle. There is one more thing here which I noted in my research. There are different views on the time when Aisha radiallahu anha died as well. So the most reliable historical source says that she was 74 when she died. Historians all agree on this point, that she lived 48 years after the death of the noble Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. 48 years, that's a documented fact. So if she lived 48 years after the Prophet died, 9 or 10 years with the Prophet, because we know that she got married 6 months to a year after the Hijrah, after the migration, that makes or accumulates to 57 years after she migrated to Medina. If she died at 74, then 57 plus 17 makes 74. Again, it indicates that she married or migrated at the age of 18, and she married after that. She probably married the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam at about 18 years old, if you consider the Islamic calendar as well. And to further support this from other historical evidences, that she was 18 years old when she married the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam during the Battle of Uhud. The Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam did not even allow underage boys to participate in the battle. If they were 13 years old, for example, or 14 years old, the Prophet ﷺ did not allow them to participate. They had to be adults to join the battle. But if you again look at the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, in book 56, hadith 278, it states that Aisha radiallahu anha was giving water to the wounded at Uhud. So again, the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, not allowing 13, 14, 15 years old boys to participate in the battle, if we were to accept the logical claim that she was born in 614, but allowed Aisha to be acting as a nurse in the battle of Uhud, then that would have been, she would have been 11 at this battle of Uhud. And taking 11 years old girl to a battle which completely contradicts the prophetic compassion and mercy, it's against the Islamic Sharia, again, which doesn't make sense. And the last reference that I have from the Quran, from Surah An-Nisa, which we talked about earlier, verse 6, where it states that the inheritance of the orphans should be given to them after the age of marriage, when they reach the age of marriage. And this is signified in fiqh by the term ar-rushd, ar-rashid, when they become rashid. And it's usually, if you look at the Islamic fiqh scholars, this is after the age of 15. So it says, give the orphans their inheritance after the age of 15, which means the age of marriage. Very interestingly, if you look at the Ottoman Empire era, the Ottoman jurists actually made a minimum age for marriage based on the Hanafi rulings. They said for females, age 17, for males, age 18. And it was very interesting fact actually for me to find out um, at the during the research, before the number 18 became the legal age of marriage in the West. And you can search this as well during the Ottoman Empire era. Now, the Islamic rulings made it clear and cut about the age of marriage. There is no such thing as marriage at 9 years old. And if people do that, they are not following the Islamic jurisprudence. They are acting against Islamic rulings. I will just end with an advice to those who are Islamophobic, who attack our noble Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Before you do so, go and have a look at the historical context. Ask a Muslim and research how people used to live. What was their social norms? Maybe you should do some research about the Middle Ages in Europe. What was the minimum age of marriage at that time? It was 11. They married at 11 years old. Not too long ago, some states here in the United States of America allowed or had no minimum age with parental consent. I think some of them are still valid at the moment in some communities. People are getting married in this modern day in the US in some states if the parents are giving consent. At the age of 12, 13, they could still get married. I don't need to mention these communities because it's not fair to them. I hope you benefited from this podcast. I will elaborate more on some notes and bring more and more historical evidence in the next episode, inshallah. The bottom line is Aisha radiallahu anha could not have been 9 years old when she married the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Historically, not possible. It just does not add up. And based on everything I mentioned, it's not like given variations. Everything is pointing towards a mature age of 18 years old. When you calculate it, you end up with 18 years old. There is not even one single contradiction there, which is very powerful evidence for everyone, for the doubts some Muslim may have had, and for those Christian apologists who use this weak, lame argument as their ammunition, because there is a load of groupthink and herd mentality taking place in Christian apologists. And nobody is willing to go against the grain and starts calling inconsistent arguments out. They allow these false arguments that are based on total fabrications to fester and spread among their apologists and missionary communities. They tell us they have the Holy Spirit, but I just don't see anything holy in these arguments. These arguments are unholy. They are intellectually dishonest. They are inconsistent. They are offensive. They are unchristian. And they are unbiblical. I know Christians talk big about love, but I just don't see it coming towards others, especially the Muslims. Or perhaps love is redefined as trying to get young Muslims to cower in corners, belittlement, mockery, and slanders when it comes to dealing with Muslims. If you are a Muslim who comes across this type of low level, inconsistent arguments, this podcast will teach you how you answer them. If you are truly a Christian, however, who claims to love Jesus, alayhi salam, I am asking, can we please have a Christ like person who is sincere and courageous enough to stand up to Christian apologists, polemicists? If you are truly a Christ like, let me tell you a story, something that Christian scholars will never tell you. And listen very carefully. The Christian world knows that the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, is the final prophet and messenger of God, the Almighty. When I say the Christian world, I'm not talking about the average born Christian. I'm talking about senior Christian scholars and theologians. And one of the top names in the Christian world stated publicly that the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, was the final prophet of Allah Azza wa Jal. His name is Professor Keith Ward, the most senior Christian theologian in the world. Today, he was once asked what his congregation, his colleagues, and the elite of the Christian academy think about the Prophet Muhammad والسلام. And he said that they virtually all believe that he is the final prophet Muhammad والسلام, as well. And many Christians who are not scholars, who don't know a thing about Christianity, let alone Islam, have no idea that the highest elite chiefs of Christianity know that Islam is the true religion of all the prophets. If you ask me, why don't these people become Muslims? Well, indeed, Professor Keith Ward was asked the same question and gave an answer which immediately reminded me of what the Quran said in the translation of the meaning when it is said to them follow what Allah Azza wa Jal has revealed. They reply, no, we only follow what we found our forefathers practicing. Would they still do so, even if their forefathers had absolutely no understanding or guidance? I mean, the Quran said this 1446 years ago, that even when you're wrong, you still follow your forefathers' traditions, even when they are wrong. Allah Azza wa Jal says in the Quran, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, وإذا قيل لهم اتبعوا ما أنزل الله قالوا بل نتبع ما ألفينا عليه آباءنا أولو كان آباؤهم لا يعقلون شيئا ولا يهتدون. صدق الله العظيم وصدق رسوله الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم.